We're going to talk now about the history of biopsychology. To give a historical context, in 1876, Wilhelm Wundt opened the first laboratory of psychology. This was in Leipzig, Germany. He developed a basic science concerned mainly with laws of conscious thought. This was an academic discipline rooted in lab research. The social context of this early period included a rapid growth of industrialization, immigration, cheap labor, and seemingly unlimited natural resources. Society began to look to science for practical answers to their everyday concerns and problems. Labor was a commodity necessary for doing business. But although it was the primary cost, most of the uncertainty in the process of production was human error. So they wanted to try to minimize the humanness of those workers. They wanted to get past those problems that humans have and mechanize them to make them the most efficient machines that they could. Industrial engineers came to the rescue to try to solve this problem. Some of those early pioneers in the area were Frederick Taylor and two of his students, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. Frederick Taylor introduced what is now known as scientific management. He essentially wanted to make work the most efficient that it could be. What he did was break down the work process, found the most efficient way of doing the work job, and standardized that procedure for all employees. And then he encouraged management to enforce that procedure. This was not a search for knowledge or of understanding of what was going on with workers in the situation, but it was a problem solving, finding practical solutions for the problem of humans being inefficient. Frank and Lillian Gilbreth then continued these studies and conducted what were called motion studies. They came up with the term Thurbligs as the element, the basic unit of human motion. And if you look at the word Thurblig, take off the S and read it backwards, and you might see a familiar name. In 1910, industrial psychology became an official field. So the early field of IO psychology consisted of people who were interested in psychology and had studied psychology in school and found that they could apply it to industrial settings. And for example, Bruce Moore, who was the first PSYOP president, was introduced to a problem with the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. The problem that they had was that they needed to be able to distinguish which apprentice engineers they had coming in would be good for different positions. They had positions that were more sales-oriented and others that were more research and design. So what Moore did is he developed tests. First, he developed tests to look at the abilities that people had. So those apprentices coming in, some of them had more social abilities, and some of them had more intellectual abilities. These are just two of the subcomponents that he looked at. He found that those who were higher on a social ability tended to perform better in sales jobs, whereas those who had a higher ability intellectually performed better in the design jobs. He later came up with a test of interests, and the idea behind it was that those who had an interest in, say, investigative work would be more likely to stay in jobs that had that kind of task. he found both of his tests to validly predict performance. Another important pioneer in early IO psychology was Munsterberg. Munsterberg was a psychologist at Harvard. He was originally from Germany and had been invited by William James to come work at Harvard. While he was there, the city of Boston was having trouble with accidents with their streetcars. They wanted to find a way to reduce these accidents. And one way to do that would be to select operators who were less likely to have accidents happen. So he went about coming up with a selection process to find drivers that would be more safe. Munsterberg is often considered the father of IO psychology. World War I was the start of an effort of psychologists to help in the military effort. The field of industrial psychology became more unified in the idea that they had a common purpose in trying to help with the war effort. Previously, individuals had just found opportunities to apply work and to apply psychology and be paid. So during World War I, Robert Yerkes was the president of APA and addressed the military community, encouraging them to look towards psychology to help with that war efforts. Psychology was used to address various issues, including motivation, morale, psychological problems, and selection and placement. In terms of selection and placement, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta tests were created as a way to look at the abilities of recruits coming into the military, and specifically the Army in this case. These are the precursors to what is the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Many of you may have taken this at some point, either in high school or if you went into the military services. The Army Alpha was the original test written in Army Alpha was the original test and was a written test with requiring verbal abilities. They found that there were people coming in, recruits who either were illiterate or maybe spoke a different language. And they created the Army Beta to deal with those people, to give them an opportunity to test their abilities without being dependent on English verbal ability. So if we click on this link here, you can go to this website and we can look at the types of questions that were given on these two tests. The Army Alpha, for example, asked questions such as, a company advanced 6 miles and retreated 2 miles. How far was it then from its first position? So the individual would have to figure the math on that and come up with an answer. The Army Beta, like I said, was created to take out the verbal requirement, the written test. And a person would work with the individual taking this test and ask them questions such as, what is missing in this picture? And you can see from this that there are various levels of complexity in these pictures. And some of them, this is often an issue with tests, is that sometimes they become outdated. And there are things here that, in terms of people who lived maybe a more rural or agricultural life, would encounter. So what's missing with the pig, or what's missing with the pocket knife. things that are dependent on one's experience with those items. So the impact that World War had on the field was pretty important. Many people were tested with these Army Alpha and Army Beta tests. However, in World War I, these were not used to the extent that they were actually tested. So people were tested, but the results were not used for selection. But they had enough information to know that this was a useful effort. This was something worth spending time and energy on and hiring people to do. As we left World War I and enter the Depression years, we have a different social context here. We entered the Depression. There were issues with mistreatment of employees. The government needed to figure out how it could deal with the economic environment. And it became a situation in which government yielded more influence on industry. There were more government regulations put into place, and it also developed a favorable climate for organized labor or for unions. These unions at this point now represented about 30% of workers, and they were demanding increased work environment, increased in better conditions for workers. The public at this point was identifying with people who were downtrodden, who didn't have the means that maybe others did or people had previously. People began to distrust big business and be in support of government interventions. Organizations began to feel pressure to take responsibility for employee welfare. Whereas before they had looked at employees more as machines, now they're starting to look at them more as individuals and humans. So industrial organizational psychology, or industrial psychology at this point, during these years also got a big boost in the government instituting the Occupational Research Program in 1933. This effort was a systematic review and documentation of occupations that existed in America. People wanted to have an impact on the economy, but we didn't feel like we could have an impact unless we knew what jobs were out there. So in order to find that out, the systematic inventory of jobs was begun. In 1940, so it took about 7 years to complete this, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles was printed. This was a big, fat book with all the different occupations categorized in various ways of all the jobs in the United States. During these Depression years also, and actually a little bit before, there began studies within the factory environment. In particular, there was a group of studies done at the Western Electric Company at their Hawthorne Works in Illinois. The researchers wanted to study the environment of the workers to determine what would be most efficient. One of the issues that they looked at was lighting. Was the lighting too bright or not bright enough for the workers in creating the electrical components that they were making? So they did a test changing up the lighting conditions. First, they added some more light and saw what happened. Add a little more light to see what happens. Added even more light. And each time they added light, the workers performed better. Now they started to find that over time, performance would go back more to the level that it had started at its baseline. So regardless of the amount of lighting, it increased and then decreased. And that included reducing the lighting, even so much at some point it became almost as dark as moonlight. So what did they make of these results? So it didn't matter what they did, it always increased performance. It increased the output of the workers. So what they concluded is that the workers appreciated that management was concerned with their work environment, that they were, for the first time, being considered in terms of having changes to make it a better situation. So the implementation of a change indicated that management was interested, and this in itself improved performance. This is now known as the Hawthorne effect. It is the increase in performance that results from some type of intervention, and it could be anything, it doesn't have to be lighting, and is followed by a gradual decline, often to the original level of performance. Out of these Hawthorne studies also came the idea that it was important to treat workers as people. I know it's surprising to think about, but at some point, management just wasn't thinking of people, but as machines, like in Frederick Taylor's day. So this led to the human relations movement and the importance that we placed on the treatment of workers. So as we move on to World War II, the role of industrial psychology, again, had an impact on the war efforts. Now, with some initial data behind us in World War I, there was evidence that using testing for selection and placement was useful and important. So the military went ahead and updated their tests and used those in order to select and place recruits and draftees. Those who were in the draft, some people got deferments based on the scarcity of workers trained to do their particular jobs. In particular, Congress decided that there could be exceptions for people who worked in a job that took 2 or more years to train for, and that had a shortage of workers in those jobs. So the Dictionary of Occupational Titles became an important document in order to determine which jobs fit that criteria. Psychologists also worked on motivation during World War II. In 1945, towards the end of this, Division 14 of APA was created. And this was done by merging APA with what was called the American Association for Applied Psychology. Previous to this time period, applied psychologists who were working both in industrial psychology and in education, military, and clinical psychology were not finding that APA was accepting of their applied work, taking the knowledge of human behavior and applying it to improve situations. So they created their own organization, which was the AAAP. In 1945, APA conceded and saw the importance of these subdivisions of psychology. After World War II, there was an economic boom. There were new ways of thinking in terms of there being new prosperity with the economic boom and with compassion that people had gained during the Depression years. There was also an end to isolationism. the idea that America could just exist for America and with America and be content in being concerned with only our own issues, and that we didn't have to worry about issues, say, in Europe or Japan. Now, we understood that we were part of a more global world. And part of this included our relationship with the Soviet Union as the Cold War ensued. Industrial psychologists during these years legitimated the field, showing that scientific rigor had a place in understanding and making changes in the workforce. Formal education in management and industrial psychology became more prominent. Previously, there had been random classes that had been put together by those interested early in the field of applying psychology to work. Now there were more formal programs, PhD programs in management and PhD programs in industrial psychology. You may have seen the name Likert before. It is often used with a type of scale in which you agree or disagree with various statements. Likert was a psychologist, a social psychologist at the University of Michigan, and he helped create what is now the organizational side of psychology. He applied social psychology principles to the workplace in order to improve things like the morale. He worked with the morale of service members during World War II. And he also developed the idea of participative management. And this is the idea that employees should be allowed to be involved in decisions within the workplace. He led an overhaul of the Weldon Company, which was a failing textile manufacturer. He was able to turn around the environment there and basically save the company. This story has been made into a play, which you may or may not have heard of, called The Pajama Game. So after this period, we have a period of government intervention. 1964, you may notice, is a critical year in the change of how industrial psychology had an impact on workplaces. During this time, there was a lot of change. There were people challenging the norms. We had Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of people looked at companies as the enemy. Young workers did not want to assimilate into the company environment that existed previously. And we saw government legislation in terms of the Civil Rights Act and creating the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In the same vein, I've listed here is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came much later in 1990, but comes out of the same energy force of trying to change things for workers to not be discriminated against in the workplace. The Civil Rights Act, Title VII, made it illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And this was important in that companies now had to prove that the decisions they were making in the workplace, human resources decisions, selection, promotions, were not based on race or based on gender, that these were based in a process that was fair and legitimate and had valid performance in those jobs. We also had an economic downturn with the oil crisis in the 1970s. So during this time, industrial psychology was pivotal in helping organizations deal with the new employment legislation. how would they show that their tests or their procedures were fair or were validly predicting the outcomes of good performance? Economic problems left organizations looking for new ways to manage as well. During this time, we had a statistical advancement in how we brought the results of past studies together. Previous to having meta-analysis, studies that were done on a particular question would be gathered up, and researchers would say, okay, well, 20% of them show that there's a relationship, but 80% show that there's not a relationship, so there might not be a relationship between these two variables. The problem with this is that if you just look at counting how many articles, some studies use much larger samples. Other studies are going to use and do use small samples. If you have a study with only 10 participants, that should not weigh equally with studies that have, say, 1,000 participants. Meta-analysis was a way of statistically combining the results from multiple studies to weight the results based on how many people were in the studies. So this gave us a better assessment of where different questions stood in terms of our understanding. In the 1980s and up to the early 2000s, we see a number of trends. There was an increasing value and interest in the field of IO psychology. There was an increase of the number of professionals in the field and in terms of the educational programs provided to train individuals interested in becoming members of the field. There was a validation of the ASVAB test. Project A was created to bring together all the information that had been gathered, testing recruits and looking at their performance afterwards. During the time between when the ASVAB came out in 1968 and later versions were developed, there were different kinds of content added or subtracted from the test. If you go to that ASVAB website, it has information on the different versions of the test and when different pieces of information were added. There were advances in technology. That Department of Labor document, the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, the big fat book, was transformed into the ONET. Now, all the information of occupations is provided in an electronic database, and it's available for people to look at and interact with. So I had sent you to that website in the previous lecture. It's an example of technology having an effect on information and work that had been created earlier. There's also been a development of online training, both in terms of education and employee training. So you are an example of this change in educational training by taking this class online. We had a shift to what's sometimes called the new economy. This was a decline in manufacturing with an increase in service jobs. People were just not doing jobs as much that used their hands. Now they had to use their brain or their social skills in a lot of the jobs that were available. This has impact on how we train workers, even as far back, if we look at the educational system, in starting to train people in high school for different kinds of jobs than we have in the past. And there was an increase in mergers and acquisitions during this time and continues to be. With that comes concern about merging climates and cultures and the importance that leadership takes on in terms of making sure that this merging of two organizations comes together smoothly and not having individual workers feel like they've been slighted or that they are not getting what those in the other organization are getting as the organizations come together. Here we have a timeline of some of the important events in the development of IO psychology. So as you see, basically starts back in the early 1900s. And we have the World Wars, we have the Department of Labor efforts with a dictionary of occupational titles, legal legislations that have been put into place that affect workplace employment practices. So some of the current trends in industrial organizational psychology include the outsourcing of IO psychology duties to consulting. Back in the early 2000s, with the economic downturn of that time period, companies didn't feel like they needed to keep their IO psychologists. They were an expense, and as they were trying to cut costs, they felt like that was one of the expenses that they could let go. So people tended then to go to consulting in order to fulfill the needs that they had in terms of verifying the validity of selection processes and in terms of any of the employee attitude or leadership training activities that they needed. Rapid changes in technology and work. We continue to see this around us, how technology is just changing so fast. And this changes the nature of work as well as what we're working with and how we're doing our work. We see more people working from home now with the technology available to do that. We also have seen increasing diversity in the workforce and globalization. We have more minorities, women, and single parents in the workforce than we did previously. And as we looked at the diversity of IO psychology as a field, we saw the increase in minorities and women over time in that as well. We have an aging workforce. As the baby boomers get older, they are increasing that age. As they retire, we will now have to replace those skilled people with the younger workforce and make sure that they are trained to do the work that will now be probably much different than the previous generation was. There's an increased focus on meeting employee demands now, that there are various kinds of benefits that organizations are providing to employees, either to draw people in or to keep their employees there. This might include things like having a daycare center on site, or having a fitness center, or providing more than required parental leave. So what is the future of IO psychology? Is this something that you see yourself being involved with? What kind of issues do you see around you in your work or your environment that would change either who are selected for jobs, how people are selected for jobs, what kind of issues are dealt with in the workplace? If you have answers to this question, feel free to post some of those on the general discussion for this module. I'd like to hear what some of your ideas are or experiences with things going on in the workplace today. And if you're old enough that you've seen changes, what kind of changes have happened?